Good morning, everyone. We are starting the press conference. And first of all, we have Justin Peterson, who would like to address the media.
I've got an important statement to make. And here it is. I want to congratulate my colleague and fellow board member, Antonio, who's getting married this weekend, to a wonderful lady by the name of Nydia Fernandez. Many of you may know her as the former executive director of CAP, the Foundation for Pediatric Cancer. So my wife and I have spent time with both Antonio and his wife, obviously, or his fiance, soon-to-be wife. And I just want to congratulate you. Wonderful lady, and I'm happy to be here, as many of my colleagues are, for the wedding. So
thank you, Justin.
I thought you all should know. Important news.
Great. Thank you, Justin. And congratulations, Antonio.
And nobody appreciates how much I scared Matthias by opening the press conference by saying I had a statement to make.
Yes, as a comms director, I love surprise statement by board members. We should do it more often.
Especially Peterson.
I'm not going to comment on that, John. So who has our first question today? Oscar Serrano.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Good morning. This question is for the new executive director, Mr. Mujica. Welcome to Puerto Rico. I wish you success in your work. I wanted to ask you, because you emphasized several times during your welcome message that your main mission basically is to recover the trust of people, and the Oversight Board needs to recover the trust of the people of Puerto Rico. Does it need to recover the trust? The Oversight Board, does it need to recover the trust of the people of Puerto Rico in any way, according to you? Like, in what way?
One, I think, is there were a lot of tough decisions that had to be made in the beginning, right? Because the finances weren't there. That was the reality. So the bank coming out of bankruptcy, we're in a different time. Hopefully, after PREPA is done, you turn the page. And then to show that when the finances are repaired, when they're fixed, now is the time to make investments back into the programs that are important for the people of the island. As Board Member Rosa mentioned, education is a priority, infrastructure is a priority. So I think now we have an opportunity of the board to regain the trust by showing that now that we've made a lot of the tough decisions, we can now start making investments in the things that are important. And I think that's how you can help to build the trust. Also, to start to have, again, I said I was going to spend immediately after this engaging in all of the stakeholders, all the people really understand what's going on. I think the reality is that the trust, I don't think it's just about the board, it's about the government in general, right? Before Promesa, before the board, there were a lot of decisions that were made on the island that the board didn't cause the problems that occurred here. The problems that occurred happened from government officials prior to here who made the decisions that resulted in requiring the board to be here. The board's actions are trying to fix that, and also, right, was part of what the federal government agreed to do. But what I'm saying is how you rebuild the trust is now to show that we're going to commit to all of the things that were in the statute by also reinvesting and putting back, now that you've fixed the finances, into the areas, into the priorities, and showing that it wasn't all about austerity. I think Board Member Medina also mentioned this. The period of austerity is largely over. Now we can turn the page, work with the government so that you don't have those mistakes again.
Another one, if I may, also to Mr. Mujica. La Junta ha tenido...
The board, Mr. Mujica, the board has had little success so far implementing reform in the government. fiscal reform, operational reform. I'm not talking about debt restructuring, but rather reforms in the functioning operations of the government. There's a topic of the municipalities. The board has been opposed to the central government funding municipalities, and we saw that this morning. The government continues to insist on doing that. And the board said this morning that it opposes things such as the tax credit for the filming industry, and now they're fighting again to have it in the fiscal plan. So there's been a lot of resistance. How do you plan to address and resolve all of these forms of resistance that the government of Puerto Rico has showed that it has to change its habits and the way it conducts government work?
Well, I want to agree with the premise that the board hasn't had successes. The board has had a lot of successes. You have one is the Commonwealth was in bankruptcy, and the debt was enormous, and it was nothing that the people of the island could afford to pay. The debt now has been reduced by over 80%. The amount of debt service, that part of the budget, right, has gone down from over $7 billion to below $2 billion. So that was the first part. Getting out of bankruptcy is the first part, and that's still not completed because we still have PREPA. So the first part is, right, eliminate the debt or reduce the debt to an affordable level. That's a success story so far. PREPA's left. Now the next stage is, okay, there's a fiscal plan that has all these reforms, and they're structural. Okay, so these are things that we need to make permanent within the government so that you don't go back. That's the first thing I said I was going to look at. Go back and see which ones of these are of the top priority, that are important, so that you don't go back, but they need to become part of the government, regardless of who's in office, right? You may have someone who's very focused on having fiscal discipline now, but that may not be the case in the future. So you have to have those structural reforms. When it comes to specific, I'm not going to comment on the specific programs that are to be funded. I can just say that the first step is you can't spend money that you don't have. So the first principle is that if you don't have the resources yet, don't start spending or say that these are priorities. That's how you got here in the first place. So you have to live within the resources you have. Now, there's a potential, there's more resources than there were the year before. We can start looking at those things. But again, it's not all about spending. It's about spending in a responsible way. You know, I'll give you the example of, passing bills when you don't know what the bills are going to cost, when you don't know what the fiscal impacts are going to be. This is not a best practice. This is just a practice that every government has to have. So I think these are things that we're in agreement with the Commonwealth government. I've had this conversation with the governor. I've had the conversation with his top staff. The next step is figuring out how do we implement and execute on those things. So that's it. I said, the successes so far has been eliminating 80% of the debt. PREPA's next. Hopefully that gets done. And then the next step is exactly what you said, is putting the reforms in place and then revisiting some of those decisions. When you didn't have money, unfortunately, funding some of these things may have been very important, but there was no money to do it. Now, potentially, there's a path, to reinvest in these areas, and that's the commitment that you have. Well, if you have resources, one is because you reduce. I'm going to work with the legislature. I'm going to work with the governor's office. I've already met with the governor. I've already met with his top staff. I've already met with some members of the legislature. So, and engage them every day, and then show them these are the things that are priorities, right? If we want to invest in these things, we have to have these structural changes and put them in place, right? Look at it holistically. It's not one or the other, and it's not, you can't just run out the clock. We have to make sure that these things are put in place. So what I'm going to do is take the financial plan, figure out the priorities, and say, we need to get these things done. Let's come up with a plan together on how to execute them. A plan by itself doesn't do anything. You have to execute them. And that's where we may not agree. And that's, if we get stuck, we're going to get stuck. But the intent here is actually to have things put in place that are permanent. I want the board to eventually fulfill the mission of Promesa, and then it goes away. But you can't, if you ask today, could you go away right now? And are all the things in place that would require you not to go backwards? I would think no.
Robert, if I might add,
I'd like to say
I'm
something.
going to be a little bit more technical on the answer. There's 4 elements that we have been dealing with, some of great uncertainty, such as Act 154, which was recently replaced at the end of the last year. It's 20% of our collections. And we have a permanent fix for that, thanks to all the great work by the administration. It wasn't done by the board, but we're very supportive of that. Certainly the legislation on Medicaid and Medicare at the federal level provides short-term stability in the finances. I believe it was legislated for about 5 years, but it does provide significant short-term stability on the amount of transfers that are going to receive for those programs. When you add to that the fact that we have a very significant amount of federal dollars flowing through the economy, while not organic in nature, we do expect some surpluses in the near term. Those surpluses provide us the opportunity to work with the administration to figure out what's the right way to spend that money. Adding to what Robert provided, which is a lot of experience and knowledge on how to really maneuver legislation and really working as a partner to the administration and the legislature, we do believe that we can turn those changes in our fiscal plan as opportunities for investments into long-term economic growth. So that's a little bit more of the how we should be able to drive growth in the fiscal plan.
Can I just add to that as well? This is something that I've been pretty passionate about on the board, is instituting these structural reforms and making sure that we have financial stability going forward. I like Robert, have been a budget director. I've been a budget director of the best managed state in the country and went in to be a budget manager of one of the worst states in the country, Michigan, when we went in. And the biggest concern I have as a board member is that if we don't get the financial structures in place, Puerto Rico's going to be wind right back up in bankruptcy, 5-10 years down the road. We as a board can do a lot. We do have the budget control here on the island, but we also need to help. We need the people to understand what's at stake here, right? I mean, there needs to be a higher accountability and a greater demand placed on the policymakers to come forward and enact structural reforms that will create that financial stability going forward. I mean, we're not scoring legislation. We're not doing consensus revenue forecasting. We're passing budgets that aren't balanced, right? I mean, this last year they didn't pass a conforming budget. And it's something that we really want to have happen so the board can disappear. Once the board terminates, we'll all go our separate ways, but the Puerto Ricans will be here working with the policymakers. And again, I'm not dumping on the policymakers, but there has to be greater accountability and more expectation from the public of their policymakers to live within their means. Nobody in this room can go home and run their finances the way the government, the policymakers have been running the finances here in Puerto Rico. If you do, you're going to be in bankruptcy, right? And so the board can do so much, but I really, I'm trying to work with everybody I can to help communicate the message out so the Puerto Ricans understand what's at stake here and how it impacts them personally. And I would encourage everybody to kind of help us get that communication out. We are not a control board. We're an oversight board, right? So we will work with the legislature. We will work with the governor. But I really believe that it's the public here in Puerto Rico that need to expect more out of its government. Otherwise, you're going to be impacted. I mean, all the policy decisions that Puerto Rico's made, the tax structure. I mean, we talked about the highest sales tax in the country here in Puerto Rico. That's what you guys are paying. I mean, you hit the top income bracket at $60,000 a year, 33%. If you all moved to the mainland, you'd pay a whole lot less in income tax. The Puerto Ricans are suffering, right? Your inventory tax, right? I mean, you can't get your car fixed or replace your refrigerator when the power bumps and you blow out your circuit board in your refrigerator because nobody's carrying inventory. These are all things that the public needs to demand and understand how it's impacting you personally, and get together and say, yes, we need greater accountability, we need structural reforms, and we need to hold our elected officials to represent the people of Puerto Rico in a way that's going to benefit us into the long term. And I think that's the way that these structural reforms will get implemented and stick. We can't do it alone as a board. We just don't have the authority, but that's really not the right way to do it anyway. But by working together, communicating how this impacts the public, I think is how hopefully, and we did it in Michigan. I'm not just talking blue sky here. That's how we did it in Michigan. The public got to a turning point where it said, we want change. And I think we've got to figure out how to get to that point in Puerto Rico, because that's how it will be implemented long term.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. For Mr. Mujica and any other member who would like to comment, it has been brought up today that there is a need to start talking about economic development. This is a topic that ever since the board started, both local economists and U.S. economists have said it should not be only cuts, but rather also economic development, because then what will come after the cuts? What do you think about what areas should be part of that economic growth plan? What should we develop and when?
So I think the board mentioned this before. We're working through it with the board, but they've identified some of the key areas of economic development. You can't have economic development on the island when you have a power grid that's unreliable. So that's the first thing. You need power, right? The ease of doing business is critically important. It can't take months, a year to get permits in order for a business to operate. The tax structure doesn't work. Board Member Nixon just mentioned some of the aspects of it, and it's far more complicated than that. It needs to get fixed. The education system. You need to have an education system that's preparing students and the children of the island for the jobs. And then and you need to restore confidence from the investor community to come here and know we have reliable power, we have a workforce that can function here. So the education system works. We have a tax system that's fair, and even the healthcare system needs reform. So all of those things are part of economic development. It's not just the concept of tax incentives, and that doesn't necessarily drive economic development. I know why people think that you need tax incentives, right, to make it more affordable, and the island does have some disadvantages vis-a-vis the mainland, but all of these things that I just mentioned are critical. That's part of economic development.
Have you identified areas of economical development?
You want me to help?
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Sure.
Como parte del comienzo, la introducción de
As part of the instructions given to Robert at the beginning, and we had an extremely successful meeting this week with the Secretary for Economic Development, Manuel Sidre, and his team. He shared with us the vision of the Economic Development Department and their economic development plan that they're working on, and it has a lot to do with education, the development of our people, training of our employees for areas where economy is growing, technology, engineering, sciences, math, and in order to achieve the plan that the Economic Development Department has, is how do you get the resources, finances that you need to carry out the necessary changes, both in our pre-K to 12th grade systems that we discussed this morning, and university systems. So we've been working with John Nixon and Justin Peterson and myself and Robert at the meeting, which was a critical meeting to start working jointly toward this. And we must hire a revitalization coordinator, Title V of the Promesa, although it's very important. We have not been able to give priority to that because first we had to get Puerto Rico out of bankruptcy as a top priority. We continue to work actively on the restructuring of PREPA with significant changes on how the PREPA will operate for the benefit of Puerto Rico in the long run. But in my opinion, and the reason why I joined the board, even more important is that the board use its knowledges, resources, and skills to help both the secretaries and the Secretary for Economic Development and the Secretary of Education, Administration, to work together, both with the governor and with Congress, to achieve, to be able to have these surpluses become investments that will strengthen our economy and allow these to be our foundation for our future development, economic development. Having the proper infrastructure, business environment to be able to grow, combined with structural reforms in the manner that the government carries out its action. For example, obtaining permits. It's in Title V as a priority. Therefore, I'm very satisfied with the fact that Robert has joined our group. And I believe that he is the right man and at the right time, as I mentioned earlier. Because as a board, we have discussed significantly that when you get out of bankruptcy, what will be the role of the oversight board? And at least speaking for myself, this topic we're talking about right now, economic development, education, infrastructure, energy, and reform in terms of how our government operates to help Puerto Rico grow economically or establish the necessary parameters for our companies to grow, that has to be from the board.
I have a second question regarding the budget surpluses. The board's estimates have been always low, and they've always been surplus collections. And this has happened for the past 3 years. So what do we do with this money? While there are these surpluses, there are important needs. We need 400 social workers. We're out of compliance with Family First. We need police. There are agencies without sufficient personnel. The University of Puerto Rico has had to go through budget cuts, but there's a surplus. So there's $700 million out there. What do we do with those surpluses? Well, part of the surplus has been allocated to the special fund because you'll recall that the pensions were at zero, basically. So something the board did when it restructured under the adjustment plan, the Commonwealth Adjustment Plan, we had in the last meeting, we presented new objectives of this pension fund. So this has got to be assigned for the future retirees, and we've had the luck so far that, given the amount of federal funds that are coming into Puerto Rico, we've ended up, and this is favorably economically, we've had better results than those projected. And you'll recall that when the budget forecasts are a crystal ball, and nobody has a perfect crystal ball. And thankfully, we've had a better economy than we expected, and we have a significant federal injection of funds. And we've had important legislative changes. We've had Law 154, which was cloud over Puerto Rico, and then we have the Medicaid, Medicare Congress. In Congress, there was a change in the assignment from the legislature, and we're looking at all these changes, and we're going to ensure, working with the administration, that we use these funds adequately to properly to towards the future. What we can't do is misuse the funds arriving from Washington in things that aren't productive in the future. If you didn't invest it, it doesn't have a long-term return, and this is a critical topic for the upcoming fiscal plan. If anybody else wants to comment.
Let's go one question at a time. Robert, do you want to say a couple of words?
No, I mean, I agree with what Member Antonio Medina just said. Just one thing is just want to reiterate is as basic budgeting principles, right? You cannot use one-time resources, right, for recurring expenses, and that is the challenge. You also want to make sure that you are not, you're not going to get it exactly on target, right? But you can't be under, right? You can't overspend, and the worst thing you can do is make commitments that you can't pay for. So if the goal is to kind of restore everything to where it was, then you're only going to go backwards. So basic principles, right? Don't spend more than you have. So to the extent that you have a surplus, we'll look at that, right? Readjust the forecast to make sure. But you'd rather have a little bit more than have less, right? And you rather not, right, make commitments that you can't then fulfill. And if you have one-time resources, then use them, right, to make investments for things that are going to, build dividends over the long term, not just on one time. And then the point about the federal funds, I think, can't be overstated. The balance sheets appear better than they otherwise would be absent those federal funds, because the federal funds are being used to replace spending that was otherwise using Commonwealth revenues. So it appears that we have more. So the point is, we'll look at those surpluses, look at it going forward. The noise is taken that we want to make sure that the forecasts, are close. But we also want to make sure that we don't go back and put in place recurring spending with one-time resources.
Great, let's go.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. Due to the secrecy of the negotiation for the PREPA generation contract, there's a lot of disinformation and there's an information vacuum. My question is the government have shared with the board the documents that you have up to now? If there's been an evaluation process of the potential contract, it's gone through almost all of the state government reviews. It just needs the governor's approval. What are the parameters under which that you would be taking into consideration during the evaluation of this contract for the privatization of electricity?
David, do you want to take that?
I'll say a word and then folks can jump in. So the process is very far along. As you know, there has been a winning bidder selected. We are quite optimistic that there will in fact be a formal contract soon. We're not there yet, but that there will be a contract with the provider soon. What we as the board look at is whether the provider is likely to be able to do what PREPA needs, and that is to take over the old generation assets, run them efficiently, and put PREPA in a position to be providing reliable energy at affordable prices forever, into the future. And there are lots of different components of that, moving from diesel as the primary source of generation more to renewables, and things of that sort. So we're thinking about all of those things, but the context for it is PREPA, even before Hurricane Maria, as people on the island know, but people not on the island don't always know, was a disaster. I mean, it went for years and years not investing in infrastructure, not investing in maintenance, and using that money to pay salaries of often patronage or trust in employees. And so this is the next step in the transformation of PREPA, and we're very excited about it, very optimistic. As I said, the contract hasn't been formally signed yet, but we're very optimistic and hope it will be very soon. As you've heard, all of the recent developments which do suggest it will be soon. Do folks want to add anything?
Good answer.
Great. Luis? Oh, wait, okay.
Sí, saludos sobre
Yes, hello. Regarding the generation contract, I'd like you to clarify if the board has formally approved the continuation of the contract. A couple minutes ago, Marrero said that in fact the board had given the approval. I just wanted to have this clear.
You're going to hear from us very soon on that. Right now, we don't have a comment.
Pues también sobre el tema de educación que
Regarding
tuvimos aquí un
education,
panel.
where we had a panel, I think that there's no doubt that education has the highest budget among the various agencies and government components. What I want to know is the Mujica's vision. If the University of Puerto Rico also has the necessary resources so that its role within the economic development project toward the future, or if the university transformation is based primarily on structural refunds, principally in the budgetary aspect. How do you see this?
So right now, we have fiscal plans that have recommendations, right, both on education and the university. That's where we are right now. I am going to relook at, right, all of those things. Like I said, we're now that we're turning the corner on bankruptcy, we can reprioritize, relook at those things. I would not say as of today on day 20 that I have plans. I have to consult with the board and go back and look at those things. But as we look to come out of bankruptcy, there may be opportunities, right, both to make reinvestments in some of the areas. But there's also a desire. It's not just turning the corner and then saying, oh, we're going to take the surpluses and make reinvestments. You have to do the reforms or you're just going to go right back. The fiscal plans are full of recommendations and reforms that need to get implemented. Otherwise, you're just adding money and they're going to have the same decisions and the same outcomes. When it comes to education, bottom line is look at the outcomes. The outcomes for education, both K to 12, right, and the university, right, have, they're questionable, right, and as they compare to other areas. I don't know what the reasons for it. It's not always just resources. So I commit to relooking at it, coming back to the board and coming up with those plans. But as I mentioned earlier, those are critical, right? The University of Puerto Rico is critical to economic development, and K to 12 education is critical to economic development. So as we turn the corner and focus on the investments, those two areas are important.
En términos de los municipios.
In terms of the municipalities, there is also reform required, at least the reduction of the government subsidy. Is that going to continue, or is there also space to look at this again? And as the government proposes, have a permanent subsidy and include that within the fiscal plans?
It's the same answer as the other one, right? It's that there might be more resources now, but we have to relook at them because everything can't be a priority. Otherwise, you're just going to go back. So you can't go, all right, you want to put the money here, you want to put the money back in every other place. So we'll look at where the priorities actually are, right, where the reforms are needed. And again, my focus is not just on temporary reforms or, plans on paper. Things have to actually be executed, implemented, and be made permanent. And then you have the confidence to put back the resources and know that you're going to have an outcome that was different than you had the first time. In the case of the municipalities, again, understand, right, these were parts of an austerity plan that were critically important to bring spending in balance with with the resources that you have. Now is an opportunity to reallocate, and that's done with the governor and the legislature, not the board alone.
Menciona que es importante que no se tomen estas medidas de gastos.
And also, in terms of the temporary expenses, that can't. In 5 years from now, is that considered a temporary period of time? Or when we talk about long term, we're talking about 10, 20 years. What does the board project in terms of these certified plans?
Financial plan, and that is what we're looking at. The Medicaid funding, right, ends after 5 years. Congress did not provide a permanent fix there. It would have been more helpful if there was something more that we could plan on, but that's what we have right now. So we have to look at what the impact of that is in the post 5 year period. And I think it took the island a lot longer than 5 years to get to the position where they were and going into bankruptcy. So it's going to take a lot longer than to plan to get out of that. So the horizon, I think, has to be longer than 5 years.
Thank you. I don't see any more questions in the room. Anything from Cyber News on Zoom? No. Okay. Thank you very much. That's it. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.